Hi, everyone. I'm Lindsay Lewis, editor of Building Enclosure. Thanks for listening along with us today. On December 18th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we have a free webinar, Emerging Trends in High Performance Enclosure Optimization. Daniel Overby, Associate Principal and Director of Sustainability from Routing Day, joins us to chat about the upcoming webinar. Dan, thanks for sitting with us.
Hey, Lindsay. It's good to be back.
So to launch into what we're going to be talking about in the webinar, what are some of the best ways design teams can go about optimizing their enclosure for high performance outcomes?
When we get into this webinar, we're going to try to walk attendees through a process, because something that I've observed in my own work over the course of many years, some recurring themes, one of them being the gravity of every project draws toward the budget, the schedule, of course, but also the minimum standard. I'm finding a lot of times out of the gate, aspirational goals for sustainability, the sky's the limit. But I'm finding this common theme of the gravitational pull of setting a minimum standard, whatever the floor is. It could be codes, it could be, I don't know, you've got a board of trustees committed to lead, it could be whatever standard you're aiming for, whatever is explicitly defined as the measurable, distinct sustainability objective, that's going to be what the gravity of the project draws toward. And as you're trying to balance all the competing priorities and the limited resource capitals of projects. So we'll back that up with data. And I would say perhaps the most potent tool to achieve high performance outcomes is the minimum standard set within the owner's project requirements, the OPR, which makes full circle in the webinar because we end this process talking about going through commissioning and enclosure commissioning and the value of that on a project. And so we'll get into everything in between. We'll get into modeling cycles for building simulation, building performance, and we'll get specific, back it up with data, try to add value.
Now, how much of this happens during the pre-design phase?
In pre-design, as much as possible would be the short answer. That doesn't always happen for a variety of reasons. But if you, and I'm talking to whoever might be listening or watching, if you are the person charged with championing sustainability on projects, you might try to champion the integrative process, bring stakeholders, direct, maybe some indirect stakeholders, bring more voices to the table, more disciplines to the table. We have the tools to do this. We have the protocols to do this. It could be really formalized, like the IPD contracts, but we're finding with AIA firm survey data, there's not a lot of uptake with this. A few reasons for that. One of the big reasons being that the tools we use through building information modeling and cloud-based resources that we share, we're naturally becoming more integrative, multidisciplinary with our processes, and we try to leverage that. And if we can start that process earlier, that's the classic McLeamy curve, you're going to get the most bang for the buck. You're going to be able to set those priorities, what those broad strokes on projects that are going to really set the outcomes in motion. That all happens very early. The more of those voices you can bring to the table, the better. So it could be really formalized with a contract like that. It could be something akin to the integrative process credit and lead. It could be the ANSI consensus standard guide. I think it's in version 2.0. It's been online for a while. There's a few different resources, and we'll get into a bit of this in the webinar.
Now, anyone that's familiar with your blog with us knows how much you love to talk about carbon. So looking at carbon assessments, what goes into these?
Yeah, a webinar about high performance and sustainability with Dan wouldn't be complete without getting in the carbon. And just a quick little primer for the listeners and viewers, carbon in quotes here as shorthand for carbon dioxide, which we use as a proxy for all greenhouse gas emissions. So we're talking about trying to assess on projects all greenhouse gas emissions. And so a carbon assessment is actually that process for measuring and evaluating the total greenhouse gas emissions that you're going to have from the project itself. That's going to be through keeping the lights on, keeping the building electrified, it's keeping it powered. That's the operational carbon, but also the carbon that went into the energy resources to actually create the bricks and mortar per se, to make the materiality. But we're going to go a little bit deeper and talk about fugitive emissions like refrigerants, which we're finding out is actually a really big deal. It's actually a big piece of the overall pie chart, bigger than you might suspect. And so we'll get into that a little bit. And we're aligning this with what LEED version 5 is going to call for with their carbon assessments that will be a prerequisite, and they go into each of those that I just described. Optionally, they go one step further, as will we conversationally, which is to get into transportation related carbon for the users of the building. And so we'll unpack this a bit and hope to add clarity and some value and set people in a good position as LEED V5 starts to roll out here at the beginning of the year.
Now, will you be going over any sort of building performance tools during your webinar?
I will. I might not drop so many names, but we will definitely talk about the process. There are different tools that are appropriate for different stages of delivering a project. And we'll actually outline a little bit of procedure through an ASHRAE standard 209. It cites 11 different modeling cycles because it's one thing to say, oh, we believe in leveraging energy modeling as a design assist tool, but that all cost fee, that costs people's time. And how many loops, how many cycles of this are we actually going to do? Is it one? Is it 11? Well, the answer is probably somewhere in between. And it's going to look a little different and answer different types of questions at different points in the process. So we will briefly unpack that as well and hope to demystify that standard and hopefully point folks in a direction where they could maybe grab that or something like that or model something akin to that to define explicitly how many modeling cycles you would need for your project to get the value out of it that you would need.
Now, looking at building enclosure commissioning, how does this come into play with what we're discussing? What benefits does this bring when it comes to ensuring high performance outcomes?
So commissioning in general, typically when it's just called commissioning on a building project, typically means for mechanical systems. What we've seen, it's been around for a while. It's not new, but what's new in terms of an emerging trend is the uptake and the familiarity. It's becoming very common now to see building enclosure commissioning, BECX, come into play on projects. And it's got the same premise as the mechanical commissioning. It's about making sure if someone listening, if you are the owner of the building, it's helping ensure that you get what you think you're paying for. You've gone through all this process. You've gone through the integrative process. You set the right goals, the explicit goals we talked about. Everything from the standpoint of design and simulation looks like it's there, but you need the follow through. You need to make sure that it's going to happen. A stat I think I've tossed out on a past webinar, Lindsay, was that some numbers out of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, 9 out of 10 projects, non-residential projects, were shown to have some kind of problem in the first year of operation in terms of the mechanical systems. 9 out of 10. I don't have data like that for the enclosure, but I think the same story is going to apply here that we know. In fact, it's maybe even in more egregious in some ways because there's so many more trades passing through the site and doing their scope of work. And the real world's messy. Building a building is messy. And a lot of quality assurance protocols could be in place that are going to help you, the owner, get what you think you're paying for. So we're going to talk about building enclosure commissioning and talk about that as this follow-through tool, unpack it a little bit, and go through the basic key elements of it: performance verification, the design review process, how it can help with material selection and installation oversight. And then you get into, just like with mechanical commissioning, you'll get into testing and documentation and reporting. And so we'll unpack that a bit too.
Well, we already covered a variety of topics, but what else will attendees learn come December 18th?
We'll learn about, I'll begin where I'll sort of wrap this thing up full circle. That what we've been talking about is an approach, it's a process to building, design, and construction. And we have the tools and the processes, and in many cases now, the expectation set forth by the codes and standards and sustainability objectives that we're trying to adhere to on projects, that we need to do it better and do it with more rigor and with more intentionality and more clarity, and leverage these tools to go beyond designer rules of thumb toward better informed decision making. We're here. That's where we are right now. So as an emerging trend, it pulls all of this together and helps it sort of coalesce around this approach, and will take you from pre-design all the way through commissioning. And I hope that folks will join us on December 18th, and we'll get into it.
Well, thank you again, Dan, for your time today.
Thanks, Lindsay. It's always fun to be here.
To sign up for this free webinar, head to continueducation.beammedia.com. Until then, visit us on buildingenclosureonline.com for your technical and educational resources.